The world first came to Elara not through sight or sound, but through the frantic, thrumming rhythm of a rabbit's heart against her own, a desperate drumbeat of pure fear that was her earliest memory, a sensation so utterly consuming that the concept of a self, of an Elara, did not yet exist. There was only the pounding, the smell of loam and danger, and the instinct to flee, to push with powerful hind legs into the dark, damp safety of the burrow, her small body trembling not from cold but from the primordial understanding of the owl's shadow that had just passed overhead. This was her cradle, her first skin, her existence of instinct and immediacy, and the transition out of it was not a birth but a slow, confusing dissolution, the rabbit's sharp senses blurring, its compact form stretching and aching in ways its simple mind couldn't comprehend, the world melting from a panorama of scent and vibration into a haze of light and muffled sound, until she found herself swaddled in soft linen, staring up at a concerned face she would later learn to call mother. The woman's features a map of love and worry, her voice a cooing, distant thing compared to the crystal-clear warning shriek of a jay. Childhood became a fractured tapestry of such moments, a secret life woven between the threads of a normal one. A trip to the market would suddenly be interrupted by the overwhelming, intoxicating pull of a sparrow's perspective from a rooftop, and for a terrifying second, she would feel her own small body become impossibly lighter, her bones hollow, her yearning for the sky a physical ache, before she clamped down on the feeling, swallowing it back with a gasp, her mother's hand tightening on hers, asking if she was all right. She learned to hide the shifts, the strange itches under her skin that meant another form was pressing to get out. She learned to quiet the chorus of whispers from the world around her, the constant invitation from every cat, dog, and beetle to step into their lives and wear their shapes. The mirror in her room was her only confidant, reflecting back a girl with ordinary brown hair and wide, fearful eyes, but if she stared too long, sometimes the reflection would flicker, a glimpse of scales, a shock of feathers, the sharp, angular face of a stranger, and she would look away, her own heart now pounding with that same rabid fear. Her parents were kind, simple farmers who knew the earth and the weather but had no language for the strange child they had been given, attributing her night terrors and sudden fevers to a fragile constitution, never guessing that the fever was her body fighting to become a fox one chilly evening, or that the night terror was the memory of briefly wearing the skin of a dying mouse in the barn. She felt like a secret even to herself, a locked box with 1,000 keys, each key a different living thing, and she lived in dread of the day the box would spring open and she would be lost, unable to find her way back to the girl in the mirror. This constant, exhausting vigilance was the price of her normalcy, a mask she wore so tightly it sometimes felt like it was fusing to her skin, and she wondered if this was all her life would be, a performance of being human, a desperate attempt to ignore the siren call of the swarm of bees in the apple blossoms, the stoic patience of the old plow horse, the sleek, fluid grace of the river otter in the nearby stream. She was 13 the day the performance shattered. It was during the autumn harvest festival, the village square bustling with laughter and music, and she was trying so hard to be present, to be normal, to focus on the taste of sweet cider and not the multitude of other lives buzzing around her, when the mayor's prized bull, startled by a crashing stack of barrels, broke free from its pen. The enormous beast, eyes wide with panic, charged through the crowd, straight toward a group of small children playing near the well. Time didn't slow down. It fractured. The screaming of the people became a high-pitched, meaningless noise. But Elara heard another sound, clear and sharp as glass, the furious, defiant screech of a peregrine falcon riding the thermals high above the chaos. It was a sound of absolute power and precision, a predator's call, and in that singular moment of terror, Elara's carefully constructed control snapped. She didn't decide to change. She simply answered the call. There was no slow dissolution this time, only a violent, instantaneous unraveling of her human self. Her bones snapped and reshaped themselves with a series of sickening cracks that were drowned out by the crowd's roar. Her skin prickled and erupted into 1,000 gray-brown feathers, her face sharpened into a fierce, hooked beak, her arms became mighty wings, and her fear transformed into a cold, razor-sharp focus. Where a scared girl had stood a second before, now a large falcon, sleek and deadly, launched into the air. The ground fell away, the screaming faces becoming a meaningless mosaic below. Her new eyes, impossibly sharp, locked onto the target, not the children, but the source of the threat. She folded her wings and dove, a feathered bullet, pulling out of the stoop at the last second to rake her talons across the bull's broad back, not to seriously injure it, but to shock it, to redirect its rage. The beast bellowed in surprise and pain, skidding to a halt and turning its massive head toward this new, aerial attacker. Elara beat her powerful wings, gaining altitude again, leading the bull's charge away from the well and toward an empty field, her mind a whirlwind of avian instinct and a single, fading human thought: away. Lead it away. She didn't see the children being snatched to safety, didn't hear the cries of the crowd shift from terror to awe. She only knew the wind beneath her wings and the large, confused creature below. It was only when the village hunters managed to loop ropes around the bull and calm it that the falcon's purpose faded. And with the purpose gone, so too did the form. The change back was even more violent, a draining of power and grace, a crushing weight of gravity as she fell the last few feet, landing naked and trembling on the cold, trodden earth in the middle of the suddenly silent square, hundreds of eyes staring down at her, the girl who had vanished and in her place left a miracle, and now, a monster. The silence that followed was a physical weight, heavier and more suffocating than the bull's looming presence had been, a thick, smothering blanket of stunned disbelief that pressed down on the entire village square, broken only by the ragged, gasping breaths that tore from Elara's throat as she lay curled on the cold, hard ground, her human skin screaming with 1,000 new sensations after the freedom of the sky, the rough press of the dirt, the chill of the autumn air raising goosebumps on her bare arms and legs, the stark, horrifying vulnerability of her nakedness before the entire world. She could not look up, could not meet the eyes that she felt burning into her, 100 points of searing judgment. She could only squeeze her own eyes shut, wishing with every fiber of her being that the earth would open up and swallow her whole, that she could become the mole she had once almost turned into, blind and safe in the deep, dark silence underground. The falcon's fierce, single-minded clarity was gone, replaced by a tsunami of human shame and terror so profound it made her physically ill, her stomach clenching as she trembled uncontrollably, trying to make herself smaller, to disappear. Then a single voice cut through the silence, not a cry of awe or thanks, but a man's voice, raw with fear and superstition, shouting, "Witch. She's a witch, or a demon," and the spell was broken, the crowd erupting into a panicked, angry buzz that was far more terrifying than the quiet had been. She heard the word, "witch," hissed from multiple mouths, heard the confusion in her mother's voice crying out her name, the sharp, commanding tone of the village elder trying to restore order, the frightened wail of a child. A rough woolen blanket was suddenly thrown over her, and strong hands, her father's hands, she knew their calloused feel even through her panic, gripped her shoulders, hauling her to her feet, his face a mask of pale, stunned confusion, his eyes not meeting hers as he pulled the blanket tightly around her and began to half-drag, half-carry her through the murmuring, parting crowd. "Make way, let us through," he barked, his voice strained and unfamiliar, and Elara stumbled alongside him, her legs weak and uncooperative, her head down, watching the cobblestones blur beneath her feet, seeing not stone but the dizzying rush of the ground from the falcon's view, feeling the ghost of wings where her arms now were. They did not go home. Instead, her father pulled her towards the village chapel, a small, stone building that suddenly seemed like a fortress or a prison, its heavy oak door swinging open as the priest, his face grave, ushered them inside away from the prying eyes and angry whispers, the door booming shut behind them, sealing them in the dim, dusty silence punctuated only by the sputtering of a single candle near the altar. Her mother was there a moment later, her face streaked with tears, rushing to Elara and clutching her, not with revulsion, but with a desperate, fierce protectiveness, whispering, "My girl, my poor girl," over and over again as she smoothed her hair, while her father stood apart, his broad shoulders slumped, staring at the stone floor as if the answers to this impossible riddle were written there. The priest, old Father Alden, approached slowly, his kind eyes filled not with fear, but with a deep, weary sadness. "Elara," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Child, what happened out there? What are you?" "Answer," in the hush of the chapel, wrapped in a scratchy blanket that smelled of incense and dust, Elara told him everything: the rabbit heart, the sparrow's pull, the flickers in the mirror, the constant, exhausting effort of holding herself together, of pretending to be just a girl. The words tumbled out in a choked, broken stream, a confession she had never imagined giving, and when she was done, she finally dared to look at her parents' faces, seeing their world shatter in real time, the simple certainties of their lives crumbling to dust. Her mother cried silent tears, holding her tighter, while her father finally looked at her, his expression unreadable, a turmoil of love and fear and something like grief. Father Alden sighed deeply, making the sign of the hearth. "This is beyond my learning," he admitted. "It is not witchcraft, for that requires intent and study. This is something innate, something of the old world." He looked at Elara's parents. "The crowd will not forget. Fear makes people cruel. She is not safe here." The truth of his words hung in the air, a death sentence for the life she had known. Her father nodded slowly, a grim resolve hardening his features. "We'll say she's taken ill from the shock," he said, his voice low and practical, the farmer dealing with a sudden storm. "We'll keep her hidden, and then we must get her away." That night, locked in her small room, Elara didn't try to sleep. She sat on her bed, listening to the hushed, urgent arguments of her parents downstairs, the occasional raised voice of a villager outside the gate demanding answers. She looked at the mirror, but her reflection was steadfastly, terribly human, a pale, frightened girl. The cage she had always felt around her soul had not broken. It had simply become visible to everyone, and the walls of her world, which had once been the borders of her family's farm, had now shrunk to the four walls of her bedroom. She was a secret no longer, and in the terrifying stillness of the night, she understood that her life had divided into a before and an after, and the path forward was a dark, unknown forest, and she was more lost than she had ever been. The journey from her bedroom to the edge of the world began not at dawn but in the deepest hour of the night, a time of shadows and secrets where the only witnesses were the indifferent stars blinking coldly in a clear, black sky. Her father's hand was firm on her elbow, his grip a tether to the only reality she had ever known, a reality that was now being left behind with every silent, hurried step they took away from the sleeping, or perhaps watchfully pretending to sleep, village. Her mother's final, tear-streaked embrace and the desperate, whispered, "Be safe, my heart," still burned against her skin, a ghostly warmth in the chill air, a memory she clutched at as if it were a talisman against the terrifying unknown that lay ahead. She wore a boy's rough spun trousers and tunic, her hair tucked under a worn cap, a feeble disguise that felt like a pathetic joke, as if changing her clothes could possibly hide the monstrous truth she carried within her. The pack on her back held a heel of bread, a wedge of hard cheese, a waterskin, and a small, heavy pouch of coins her father had pressed into her hand, his life's savings, a weight of sacrifice that made her shoulders ache more than the physical burden. He did not speak as they walked, his usual comforting silence now strained and brittle, filled with all the things that could not be said, the fear, the confusion, the love that was now laced with a terrible, unspoken question of what she truly was. They followed dear trails known only to him, paths that circumvented the main road, the darkness under the ancient trees so complete that Elara felt her other senses straining, reaching out, the edge of panic making the world shimmer with potential change. The rustle in the undergrowth wasn't just a sound, it was an invitation to become the fox that made it, the hoot of an owl a siren's song to take to the skies again and flee this painful, heartbreaking march towards exile. She fought it down, clenching her fists until her nails bit into her palms, using the sharp pain as an anchor to her human form, to the girl who was leaving home. They reached the old stone bridge that marked the absolute boundary of her world, the place where the familiar fields ended and the vast, dark expanse of the Whispering Wood began, a place of childhood stories and warnings, a realm of bandits and wild beasts and things best left unspoken of. Her father stopped, his big frame outlined against the starry sky, and finally turned to her, his face a mask of anguish in the dim light. "You cannot come back, Elara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Not until you understand this gift. Not until you can control it. Or until they forget." He pulled her into a crushing embrace, a hug that felt like both a welcome and a farewell. "Find the city of Veridia, far to the east. Lose yourself there. Be no one." And with that, he turned and walked away, his figure quickly swallowed by the darkness, leaving her utterly alone for the first time in her life. The silence of the forest descended upon her, a living, breathing entity far more profound than the shocked quiet of the village square. It was a silence filled with a million tiny sounds. The scuttle of insects, the sigh of the wind in the high branches, the distant howl of a wolf that sent a primal shiver down her spine. She stood frozen on the threshold, the weight of her father's command, "Be no one," echoing in her mind. But the forest seemed to whisper something else entirely. It didn't see a monster or a witch. It simply saw life. The urge to change, to shed this terrified, lonely girl's skin and become something else, something that belonged to this wild place, was a physical pressure, a buzzing in her blood. She took a trembling step forward, then another, crossing the bridge, the stones cold even through her boots. She was Elara, but she was also the rabbit, the falcon, the fox in the bushes. She was a girl standing at the edge of a dark wood, and she was utterly, completely alone, but for the first time, the cage door was open, and the terrifying, exhilarating question hung in the cold night air. Who, or what, would she choose to be? The darkness under the canopy was absolute, a suffocating velvet blackness that pressed in on her from all sides, erasing the path behind her and rendering the world ahead an impenetrable mystery. Every rustle of a leaf, every snap of a twig under her own clumsy human feet was a thunderclap in the oppressive silence, each sound a potential threat her eyes were useless to identify. Her human senses, so dull and limited, screamed at her to freeze, to hide, to make herself small, a recipe for being found. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, tightening with every ragged breath she drew, and the memory of the falcon's power, its sharp, clear vision and effortless dominion over the landscape, was a taunt. She could be that again. She could be up there, above the choking fear, seeing the paths through the wood laid out like a map. The temptation was a physical ache, a pull in her very bones, but the memory of the village square, of the crushing shame and the label of witch, held her back. To change was to be a monster. To stay human was to be terrified, blind, and lost. She stumbled on, her hands scraping against rough bark as she felt her way forward, tears of frustration and fear mingling with the cold sweat on her face. The decision was made for her when a low, guttural growl rumbled from the shadows to her right, a sound so deep and full of menace that it vibrated in her chest. She froze, her blood turning to ice. 2 pinpricks of amber light ignited in the darkness, low to the ground, watching her. A wolf. Her mind screamed the stories she'd been told all her life, of wolves that hunted the deep wood, of their cunning and the pack nature. Was there only one? Panic, pure and undiluted, obliterated all thought of morality or monsterhood. Survival was the only imperative. She didn't try to shape the change, to guide it, she simply let the terror take over, throwing open the doors of her soul and begging for the first form that answered. The transformation was not the clean, powerful shift into the falcon but a violent, writhing contortion. Her body shuddered and collapsed, her bones cracking and reshaping with a series of sickening pops, her skin prickling as coarse, gray fur erupted across her limbs. Her perspective shrank, plummeting towards the forest floor, the world swelling in size and detail around her. The smell of damp earth and rotted leaves became a complex symphony of information. The scent of the wolf, musky, predatory, hungry, now a vivid, terrifying banner in the air. Where a terrified girl had stood was now a large, powerfully built badger, her head low, her legs planted with a stubborn, innate solidity. The wolf, a large male, emerged from the shadows, its lips pulled back in a snarl, confused by the sudden disappearance of the easy, two-legged prey and the appearance of this new, low-slung creature that smelled of defiance and iron strength. It lunged, not to kill, but to test, to snap at this thing that dared to stand its ground. The badger's instincts, ancient and uncompromising, took over. Elara's human consciousness was submerged beneath a wave of pure, territorial rage. She didn't think, she reacted. With a furious hissing grunt, she moved with a speed that belied her bulky form, ducking under the snapping jaws and driving her own powerful shoulder into the wolf's leg, her sharp, strong claws raking down its flank. The wolf yelped in surprised pain, jumping back. It circled, more wary now, but the badger did not flee. It turned with it, a grumbling, tenacious engine of fury, refusing to give an inch of ground. The standoff lasted for long, tense minutes, the wolf finally deciding this prickly, foul-tempered meal was not worth the injury and melting back into the woods with a last, frustrated growl. Only then did the badger's adrenaline fade. The feral rage receded, and Elara's human mind surfaced, gasping and disoriented within the alien body. She was on all fours. She could smell everything. The iron tang of the wolf's blood on her claws, the millions of microbes in the soil, the distant promise of water. She tried to stand, to become bipedal again, and failed utterly, her badger body refusing the command. A new, different panic set in. What if she was trapped? What if the girl was gone forever, lost inside this creature? She focused every ounce of her will, not on standing, but on remembering, the feel of her mother's hands, the sound of her father's voice, the taste of cider at the festival. She clung to the memory of her own face in the mirror. There was a wrenching sensation, a nausea-inducing swirl, and she was sprawling on the leaf litter, human again, naked and shivering, the rough boy's clothes shredded around her. She scrambled back into the tattered tunic, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had changed to survive. And she had changed back. She had not been lost. The realization was a tiny, fragile flame in the overwhelming darkness. She was not just a monster. She was a girl who could become other things. And in this terrifying wood, that might be the only thing that could keep her alive. The first gray light of dawn did not so much break as it seeped into the forest, a slow, hesitant dilution of the absolute black that had cradled, or suffocated, her through the night. Elara had not slept, curled into the hollow of a great oak's roots, every nerve still screaming from the violent duality of her encounter, her mind replaying on a loop the sensation of the wolf's hot breath, the powerful surge of the badger's rage, and the terrifying vertigo of almost losing herself within it. The shredded tunic offered little warmth or modesty, and the practical reality of her existence now pressed in on her with the cold morning air. She was alone, hunted, possessed of a power that was as likely to destroy her as save her, and she had to move. Her father's directive, find the city of Veridia, was a compass point in a featureless void, a direction without a path. East. She looked up, searching for the sun through the thick canopy, but saw only a murky, greenish gloom. She had to get higher. The thought sent a fresh jolt of anxiety through her. The falcon's form was potent, glorious, but its memory was inextricably linked with her exposure and exile. To become it again felt like inviting the same catastrophe. But the badger had been a reaction, a panicked answer to a scream for help. What if she could choose? What if she could ask for something specific, something less conspicuous than a giant bird of prey? She focused on the memory of a squirrel she'd often watched from her window, a creature of breathtaking agility and utter normalcy in a wood. She held the image in her mind. The sharp, curious face, the bushy tail, the light, precise bones. She asked her body to become that. The change was different this time. It was not the violent, involuntary explosion of the badger or the swift, terrifying unraveling into the falcon. It was a subtle, almost gentle melting. She felt herself shrinking rapidly, the world swelling to monumental proportions around her, the moss on the forest floor becoming a thick carpet, a single leaf a potential blanket. Her skin prickled with 1,000 tiny itches as soft gray fur covered her hands and feet becoming delicate, clever paws with sharp claws perfect for gripping. Her perspective shifted, the world now a vertical plane of endless climbing opportunities. The fear that had been a constant, heavy stone in her human chest was now a small, quick flutter, a background alertness to danger that was overshadowed by an overwhelming curiosity. She was Elara, but she was also the squirrel, and the two consciousnesses blended in a way they hadn't with the more bestial forms. Her human mind observed with wonder as the squirrel's instincts took over, scampering up the rough bark of the oak with an effortless grace she could never have imagined possessing. In moments, she was high in the canopy, and the world opened up. The rising sun was a clear brilliant orb in the east, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, her direction. She could see the rolling sea of the whispering wood, and far, far in the distance, a faint, hazy smudge on the horizon that might have been smoke from countless hearths, Veridia. But the squirrel's eyes also saw the immediate dangers. The hawk circling lazily on a thermal, the sleek, dark shape of a pine marten moving through the branches a few trees over. This was not a safe place to be small. She needed to travel, not perch. She focused again, thinking of endurance, of ground covered, of a form that could move swiftly and quietly through the undergrowth without attracting the attention of the things in the trees or the sky. The fox. She'd seen them often on the farm's edge, ghosts of red and gray at twilight. The change was smoother this time, a flowing reshuffling of self. The squirrel's lightness condensed into the fox's lean, muscular strength. She dropped from the branch, landing softly on the forest floor on 4 silent paws. Her nose was suddenly flooded with a universe of scent, the trail of a deer from hours ago, the musk of the marten above, the distant promise of a stream. Her ears swiveled independently, catching the rustle of a mouse in the dry leaves. She was a creature of the margins, built for stealth and distance. And so she ran. The fox's body was a revelation of efficiency, each stride eating up the ground, weaving through the trees with an innate knowledge of the path of least resistance. She ran towards the sun, her human purpose, east, Veridia, safety, couched comfortably within the simple, joyous instinct to move, to explore, to survive. She was not a girl running through the woods. She was the woods running, a red blur in the dappled light, and for a few precious hours, the weight of her exile was lifted, replaced by the pure, primal poetry of motion. She was learning. She was not just changing. She was choosing. And with each chosen skin, the cage of her fear grew a little weaker. The fox's effortless lope carried her for miles, a red streak of instinct and motion through the dappled corridors of the ancient wood, the simple, driving purpose of the creature syncing perfectly with the singular human directive to go east. The world was a river of scent and sound, the damp, rich perfume of loam, the sharp tang of pine resin, the distant, cool whisper of water calling to a primal thirst. It was this last scent that grew dominant, pulling her off the vague game trail she'd been following and down a gentle, rocky slope towards the chuckling music of a stream. The fox's mind saw only water and a chance to rest. Elara's mind, nestled within, felt a surge of relief. But as she broke through the final line of ferns, the scene that greeted her was not one of solitary wilderness. A boy, perhaps a year or two older than her, was kneeling at the water's edge, filling a waterskin. He was dressed in practical, worn leathers, a long knife at his belt, his hair the color of dark earth and his shoulders already broad with the promise of a man's strength. He moved with a quiet competence that spoke of a life lived in these woods. The sight of another human sent a jolt of pure, undiluted terror through Elara, a fear so sharp it severed her tenuous control over the fox's form. There was no conscious decision, no chosen change. It was a panicked, reflexive snap back to her base self, a violent and immediate reversion that left her stumbling forward onto her hands and knees in the soft bank mud, naked and utterly exposed, the boy's clothes once again a pile of torn fabric at the edge of the trees where the transformation had begun. The boy spun at the sound, his hand going to his knife hilt in one fluid motion, his eyes wide with shock and confusion as they took in the apparition before him, a mud-streaked, wild-eyed girl where a moment before there had been nothing but forest. He didn't speak, didn't move, his gaze flicking from her to the empty woods around them, trying to piece together an impossible puzzle. Elara scrambled backward, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, the cold mud squelching between her toes, her arms crossing over her chest in a futile gesture of modesty. "Please," she choked out, the word raw and unfamiliar in her throat. Don't be afraid." It was a ridiculous thing to say. She was a trembling personification of fear itself. The boy's grip on his knife loosened slightly, though his wariness remained etched into every line of his face. His eyes, a deep, forest green, held hers, and she saw not the superstitious terror of the villagers, but a sharp, assessing curiosity. "Where did you come from?" he asked, his voice low and steady, not accusatory, but genuinely perplexed. He was looking for a logical explanation. A hidden camp, a fall from a tree, anything. Elara's mind raced, lies and half-truths tangling on her tongue. She could say she was robbed, that she'd been bathing, but the shredded clothes lying near the trees told a different story. The truth was a dangerous currency, but in his steady gaze, she saw a chance, however slim, that it might not be met with a pitchfork. "I was running," she whispered, the partial truth feeling like a betrayal and a confession all at once. He followed her glance towards the tattered clothes, his brow furrowing. Slowly, deliberately, he shrugged off his own worn wool cloak and held it out to her, keeping a respectful distance. "Here," he said, his tone practical, devoid of the fear or reverence that would have made it unbearable. "You'll freeze." The simple kindness, the lack of immediate condemnation, was so disarming it brought fresh tears to her eyes. She took the cloak with trembling hands, its rough, homespun fabric smelling of wood smoke and fresh air, and wrapped it tightly around herself, its voluminous folds swallowing her whole. "My name is Kale," he said, not moving closer, giving her space. "My family's trapline runs this stream. You're a long way from anywhere." He was waiting for a name, for a story. She swallowed hard, the words sticking in her throat. She could not be Elara from the village. That girl was gone. She looked down at the mud, at the cloak that was not hers, and the name came to her. "Elara," she whispered, borrowing the name from a story her mother had told her, a name that meant nothing and held no history. "My name is Elara." Kale nodded slowly, accepting the name without question. "You're headed east?" he asked, his sharp eyes missing little. She could only nod mutely. "The wood gets treacherous further on. There are things, not all of them are friendly to people traveling alone." He paused, studying her for a long moment, making a decision. "Our stead is not far. You can have a meal, proper clothes, then you can be on your way." It was an offer, not a demand. A risk, but the alternative was to run again, to change, to lose herself in the wild with no supplies and no plan. This boy, Kale, with his steady green eyes and his practical offer of a meal, was the first anchor to humanity she'd encountered since her exile. He had seen her vulnerability and not recoiled. He had offered a cloak, not a curse. Numbly, hesitantly, she nodded her agreement, the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. She would follow him, this stranger in the woods, and pray that her desperate trust was not a mistake that would finally, truly, be her end. The walk to Kale's steading was conducted in a silence that was neither comfortable nor hostile, but thick with unspoken questions. Elara, she had to remember to be Elara now, kept a few paces behind him, the oversized cloak trailing on the ground, her senses screaming even in her human form. Every snap of a twig under his boots made her flinch, every distant bird call was analyzed for a hidden warning, her body thrumming with the latent energy to change, to become something that could flee or fight in an instant. Kale moved with a quiet, grounded certainty, his presence a stark contrast to her own fractured reality. He belonged to this wood in a way she only could through theft, through wearing its skins as a disguise. He didn't try to make conversation, for which she was desperately grateful, his silence a gift that allowed her to wrestle her panic back into its cage. The steading was not a farm in the way she knew it, but a defiant outpost carved into the very body of the forest. A sturdy log cabin, its roof thick with moss, stood nestled against a rocky overhang, smoke curling lazily from its stone chimney. A small, well-tended vegetable patch was protected by a high fence of sharpened stakes, and the air smelled of wood smoke, curing hides, and the rich, earthy scent of the forest itself. An older man, with Cale's same green eyes and a beard shot through with gray, was tanning a hide on a stretcher outside. He looked up as they approached, his eyes immediately narrowing at the sight of a stranger, his hand resting casually on the haft of a hatchet stuck in a log beside him. "Cale," he said, his voice a low rumble. "What's this you've found?" Cale didn't break stride. "Found her at the Silver Stream. Says her name is Elara. She's in need of a meal and some decent clothes." He presented her not as a prize or a problem, but as a simple fact of the wood, something that needed addressing. The man's gaze, sharp and assessing, swept over Elara, taking in the mud, the borrowed cloak, the fear she knew was plain on her face. He saw a lost girl, not a monster. After a long moment, he gave a single, curt nod. "See to your mother," he said, returning to his work, the dismissal a tacit permission. Inside the cabin, the warmth was a physical embrace, the air rich with the smell of simmering stew and baking bread. A woman with a kind, weathered face and hands red from work looked up from the hearth, her expression shifting from surprise to swift, practical concern. "Goodness, child," she said, her voice warm like the fire. "You look like you've tangled with a whole family of sprites." Cale fetched the spare trousers and tunic from the chest. "And you, come sit by the fire." There were no endless questions, no demands for a story. There was only practical, immediate kindness. A bowl of thick stew was placed in her hands, its heat seeping into her bones. A set of clean, worn clothes, a young man's cast-offs, were given to her with a soft towel and a pointed look towards a curtained-off area for privacy. As she changed, the rough-spun fabric soft against her skin, she listened to the low murmur of voices from the main room. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was not one of alarm or suspicion, but of quiet discussion. These people, living on the edge of the world, understood hardship. They understood that sometimes people arrived with nothing but the clothes on their back, and that the why of it was often less important than the what now. When she emerged, Cale's mother simply smiled. "Better." Elara could only nod, her throat too tied with an emotion she couldn't name. Gratitude, guilt, a profound and aching homesickness for a version of this she had lost. Cale was sharpening his knife by the fire, but his eyes lifted to meet hers. "You said you were headed east," he stated. "Towards the plains. The way is clearer if you follow the northern ridge trail. Fewer ravines. But you'll want to be through the Blackroot bog before sundown. It's no place to be after dark." He was giving her directions. He was expecting her to go. The safety of this cabin was a temporary illusion, a single, warm room in the vast, cold expanse of her exile. His father entered then, wiping his hands on a rag. "The wood is unsettled," he said, his voice gravelly and direct. "Strange things seen near the old stones. Wolves acting bold, not like themselves. You travel alone, you best have a light step and a quicker wit." He looked at her, and for a terrifying second, she thought he saw right through her, through the borrowed clothes and the borrowed name, to the chaotic power simmering beneath. But he just nodded. "You can sleep in the loft tonight. Move on at first light." The offer was blunt, but it was shelter. It was safety for one night. As she lay later on a pallet of sweet-smelling hay in the loft, listening to the settling sounds of the family below, the truth of her situation crystallized. These people, with the pragmatic kindness, saw a lost girl. They did not see the monster she contained. To stay longer was to risk them seeing it. To risk the fear returning to their eyes, the kindness turning to horror. She had to be Elara, just Elara, for a few more hours. And then she had to disappear back into the wood before her other self could betray her and shatter the first fragile piece she had found since her world ended. The path east was still her only course, But the memory of this hearth, however brief, would be a new kind of ghost to carry with her. The predawn light was a pale, grey whisper through the cracks in the loft when Elara slipped from her pallet, moving with a silence that was no longer entirely human, a legacy of the fox's ingrained stealth. The cabin below was still, filled with the deep, regular breathing of sleep. She had taken nothing but the clothes she wore and a single, hard journey cake she'd palmed from the kitchen shelf, a small theft that burned with guilt but was necessary for the lie she had to maintain, the lie of being an ordinary, if unfortunate, traveler. To take more would be to acknowledge a debt she could never repay and to reveal a need that went beyond the simple. She left Kale's folded cloak neatly on her chest by the door, a silent thank you and a farewell, then eased the heavy door open just enough to slide out into the biting cold of the new day. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, the fragile persona of Elara began to fray, the wild energy of the wood pressing in on her, eager and insistent. She couldn't afford the slow, blind travel of a human girl, not with the warnings of the unsettled forest and the treacherous bog ahead. She needed speed, distance, and the heightened senses of a form built for this world. The memory of the fox's effortless run was a potent lure, but its scent was a bright flag to any predator. She needed something else, something that could cover ground and blend into the dappled shadows of the undergrowth. She thought of the sharp, intelligent eyes of the forest cats that sometimes haunted the edges of her old farm, creatures of solitude and immense patience, their passage a silent ghosting through the world. Focusing on that image, the lean muscle, the soft padded feet, the keen eyes that saw in the low light, she let the change flow through her. It was quicker now, more assured than the squirrel or the badger, a conscious pouring of herself into a new vessel. Her bones lightened and reshaped, her skin bloomed with a coat of mottled gray and brown fur, and her senses sharpened to a razor's edge. Where a girl had stood, a lynx now crouched, tufted ears swiveling, taking in the symphony of the waking forest. The world was a tapestry of sound and scent, the scratch of a beetle under a log, the musky trail of a vole from the night before, the distant, cold smell of water that meant the bog. With a powerful, uncoiling spring of muscle, she began to run. The lynx's body was a marvel of efficiency and silence, a predator's engine built for stalking, but now turned to the purpose of miles. She fell into a ground-eating lope, a fluid motion that carried her through the tangled underbrush like a shadow, her paws making no sound on the damp earth. She followed the rising sun, her internal compass now aligned with the primal one of the creature she wore. The forest began to change around her. The great oaks and pines gave way to twisted, stunted trees with pale bark, and the firm ground turned soft and spongy underfoot. The air grew heavy and still, thick with the smell of decay and stagnant water. This was the Blackroot Bog. Kale's warning echoed in her feline mind. No place to be after dark. She pushed on, her pace slowing as the terrain became treacherous, her sharp eyes spotting the patches of quicksand-like muck that lurked beneath carpets of innocent-looking moss. The silence here was different from the deep wood. It was a watchful, hungry silence. It was in this eerie quiet that a new scent hit her nostrils, one that was profoundly, unsettlingly out of place. It was the smell of iron, of old blood, and something else underneath, something metallic and cold that had no business in this place of rotten life. The lynx's instincts screamed at her to avoid, to circle wide, but the human curiosity buried within her was pricked. She crept forward, low to the ground, using the haggard trees and hummocks of grass for cover. The scent led her to a small, relatively dry island of land encircled by gnarled blackroots. And there, in the center, was the source. It was a wolf, or what was left of one. It lay on its side, its body contorted in a final, agonized spasm, its lips pulled back from teeth stained with something dark that wasn't blood. But it was the wound that held her gaze, that made the lynx's fur bristle along her spine. A jagged shard of dark, metallic stone, the color of a bruise and gleaming with a faint, sickly inner light, was protruding from its chest. It wasn't a knife or a hunter's arrow. It was something else entirely, something that seemed both part of and alien to this world. And the wolf's eyes, clouded in death, were fixed open, staring at nothing with a look of not just pain, but of a profound, mindless rage. This was what Kale's father had meant. The woods were unsettled. This was wrong. This was a violation of the natural order she felt in every fiber of her current form. A deep, instinctual revulsion washed over her, a desire to be as far from this place and this thing as possible. She backed away, the lynx's silent tread becoming a frantic, fleeing dash through the bog. The image of the dead wolf and its unnatural wound burned into her mind. The freedom of the shapes she wore now felt fragile, a temporary disguise in a world where something new and terrible was hunting, something that left a cold, metallic scar on the world itself. Her flight east was no longer just an escape from her past. It was a flight from a terrifying and unknown future. The lynx's flight from the bog was a blind, panicked scramble, every muscle driven by a primal revulsion that eclipsed any sense of direction or purpose beyond a way. The image of the dead wolf, the unnatural stone jutting from its chest like some blasphemous growth, was seared behind her eyes, a constant, horrifying companion to the rhythm of her pounding heart. It was only when the spongy, sucking ground gave way to the firm, leafy loam of higher ground and the oppressive stink of decay began to fade that the sheer, mindless terror began to recede, allowing a sliver of her human consciousness to surface through the lynx's feral instincts. She was exhausted, her borrowed muscles trembling with fatigue, the adrenaline that had fueled her escape now burned out, leaving a hollow, aching fear in its place. She needed to stop. She needed to be human again, if only to try and make sense of what she had seen. Finding a dense thicket of hawthorn, she pushed her way into its heart, the sharp thorns scraping harmlessly against her thick fur, and willed the change. It was a relief to feel the lynx's form dissolve, to feel her own limbs lengthen and reshape, the overwhelming sensory world of the predator narrowing back to the limited, familiar scope of a girl. She collapsed onto the leaf litter, breathing heavily, the rough spun clothes from Kale's family now feeling like a fragile, laughable armor against the memory of that cold, metallic evil. She was huddled there, knees drawn to her chest, trying and failing to banish the image from her mind, when a new sound reached her human ears, not the natural sounds of the forest, but the distinct, rhythmic crunch of footsteps, accompanied by a low, humming tune. Panic flared anew. Had she been followed? Was it whatever had killed the wolf? She froze, scarcely daring to breathe, peering through the lattice of thorns. The figure that emerged into a small clearing nearby was not a monster. It was an old woman, bent almost double over a gnarled walking staff, a basket laden with roots and herbs hanging from her arm. Her face was a roadmap of deep wrinkles, and her clothes were a patchwork of faded fabrics, but she moved with a steady, purposeful gait that belied her apparent frailty. She stopped not 10 paces from Elara's hiding place, her humming ceasing as she straightened with a soft grunt and looked directly at the thicket. "You can stop your hiding, child," the woman said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves, yet carrying a strange, unwavering clarity. "The thorns may hide your shape, but they do little to quiet the storm inside you." Elara's blood ran cold. How could she know? She remained perfectly still, hoping it was a trick, a guess. The old woman sighed, a sound of mild exasperation. "The badger's stubbornness suits you, but the fox's fear does not, nor does the lynx's panic. Come out. I have no interest in causing you harm. Quite the opposite." Every word was a hammer blow. She knew about the badger at the stream, the fox, the lynx. She knew everything. Paralyzed with a new kind of terror, Elara could only watch as the woman settled herself on a fallen log with a weary sigh, placing her basket beside her. "You are not the first of your kind to pass through these woods, though it has been many a long year," the woman continued, as if conversing with the air. "The old blood is stirring again. I felt it the moment you crossed the stone bridge. A ripple in the deep, quiet pools of the world." Slowly, hesitantly, driven by a desperate, clawing need for answers that outweighed her fear, Elara pushed her way out of the thicket, thorns catching at her clothes and hair. She stood before the old woman, her posture defensive, ready to bolt. The woman's eyes, a surprisingly clear and sharp gray, studied her not with fear or wonder, but with a deep, ancient knowing. "What are you?" Lyra whispered, her voice hoarse. The woman gave a dry, crackling laugh. "I am a listener, a rememberer. Some call me a witch, but that is a word for those who need simple labels for things they cannot understand." She gestured to the log opposite her. "Sit. Your energy is like a scattered fire, and it draws attention you do not want." When Lyra didn't move, the woman's expression softened slightly. "You saw something in the bog. Something that should not be." It wasn't a question. Lyra could only nod, her throat tight. "The blight-stone," the old woman murmured, her face grim. "A poison in the world's blood. It twists what it touches, feeds on life, and leaves only rage and corruption. It has been asleep for a long time. Its waking is a bad omen." She looked at Lyra, her gaze piercing. "And you, little shifter, with a soul unanchored and dancing between skins, you are a bright flame in the growing dark. A beacon, for both those who would guide you, and those who would snuff you out." The words should have terrified her, but there was a strange comfort in them, a comfort of finally being seen and named, not as a monster, but as something else entirely. "What do I do?" Lyra asked, the question a plea. The old woman rummaged in her basket and pulled out a small, smooth stone veined with a faint bluish silver, tossing it to her. "You keep moving east, to Veridia. Lose yourself in the city's great noise, as your father said. But know this, your changing is not a curse. It is a language, and you have only learned to scream a few words in terror. You must learn to speak it, to sing it, or the storms you feel inside will tear you apart." She stood, picking up her staff. "The path is yours to walk, but now you walk it with your eyes a little more open." And with that, she turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving Lyra alone once more, clutching the cool, veined stone, her mind reeling with words like shifter, blight-stone, and old blood, the first pieces of a map to her own impossible existence. The old woman's words echoed in the hollows of Lyra's mind, a chaotic symphony of terrifying portent and the first fragile threads of understanding. Shifter, blight-stone, old blood, they were names for the maelstrom inside her, and though they spoke of danger, they also, for the first time, spoke of a reason, a context beyond mere monstrosity. The smooth, veined stone felt cold and heavy in her palm, a tangible anchor to the bizarre encounter. She was a beacon, the woman had said. The thought made her skin crawl. She didn't want to be a beacon. She wanted to be invisible, to be no one, just as her father had instructed. But the woman had also implied that her very nature made that impossible. The energy she radiated, the scattered fire of her soul, was apparently a signal flare in the growing dark. The memory of the wolf, twisted and corrupted by the blight-stone, was a grim testament to what that darkness could do. She couldn't outrun this by simply being human. The lynx's speed had been necessary, but its form had brought her too close to the bog's horror. She needed to be something else entirely, something that could move with purpose but also with a profound anonymity, a creature so common it was beneath notice. She thought of the countless crows that haunted the edges of fields and forests, their raucous calls a constant, ignored background noise to the world. They were observers, opportunists, creatures that belonged everywhere and nowhere. Focusing on the image, the glossy black feathers, the sharp, intelligent eyes, the light, strong bones built for distance, she called upon the change. It was becoming a more familiar sensation, this conscious reshaping, though no less unsettling. The world tilted and swelled as she shrank, the colors leaching into a spectrum of blues and grays, the rich smells of the forest fading into a simpler, sharper olfactory world. Her arms became wings, her human worry momentarily submerged beneath the crow's cunning, curious consciousness. With a powerful beat of her new wings, she launched into the air, the problems of the earth falling away beneath her. This perspective was different from the falcon's majestic soar. It was lower, more engaged, a view of the world from the treetops down. She flew east, following the ribbon of a river that gleamed silver below, her crow's eyes missing no detail, the otter sliding into the water, the deer drinking at the bank, the distant smoke of a woodcutter's hut. She saw the world as a map of resources and dangers, and for a time, the sheer simplicity of it was a relief. It was from this vantage point that she saw them. Two figures on horseback, moving with a purpose that was starkly out of place in the wild landscape. They were not farmers or trappers. They were clad in dark, practical leathers that spoke of long travel, and their horses were fine, strong beasts. But it was the glint of metal that caught her crow's eye, not weapons, but something else. One of the riders held up a device, a complex arrangement of polished brass and crystal that he swept slowly back and forth across the horizon. As the device passed in the general direction of her flight, a faint, almost imperceptible hum resonated through her crow form, a vibration that felt like a physical wrongness, an itch deep in her bones. The crow's instinct was to caw in alarm, to bank away. The man with the device stiffened, his head snapping up. He couldn't possibly have heard her, but he seemed to have felt something. He said something to his companion, pointing vaguely in her direction. A cold dread, colder than the high air, washed through her. The old woman's warning was terrifyingly real. They were hunting, and they were using something that could sense her. She dropped lower, weaving through the tree branches, using the canopy as cover. She watched them from a distance, her heart a frantic drumbeat against the crow's hollow bones. The riders conferred, then urged their horses forward, following the course of the river, their pace now more determined. They were tracking her. The freedom of the crow's form vanished, replaced by the chilling certainty of being prey. She was a beacon, and she had just been seen. Her flight to Veridia was no longer a journey of exile. It was a race. And she had just learned that her greatest gift, the ability to become anything, might also be the very thing that led her hunters right to her. The crow's flight became a frantic, zigzagging dash through the canopy, no longer a journey but a desperate evasion. The faint, metallic hum from the hunter's device had faded, but the psychic echo of it remained, a cold hook lodged in her awareness, a certainty that she had been seen, sensed, in a way she didn't understand. The river below was no longer a guide but a treacherous open line they would surely follow. She had to break away, to put distance and confusing terrain between herself and those methodical, terrifying riders. She pushed the crow's body harder, flying lower now, using the thick, overhanging branches of willow and oak as a screen, her sharp eyes constantly scanning behind her for any sign of pursuit. The forest began to change again, the trees growing larger and older, their branches forming a dense, tangled roof that plunged the world below into a deep, green twilight. This was the Deepwood, a place of ancient silence and immense, brooding presence. It felt old in a way that the rest of the forest did not, a primordial age that pressed down on her spirit, dampening the frantic edge of her panic with a weight of centuries. Here, even the air felt still and heavy, thick with the scent of damp stone and things that had been decaying for a very long time. She found a small, hidden clearing dominated by the colossal, moss-covered ruins of what must have once been a great tree, its trunk now a hollowed-out shell large enough to shelter a horse. It felt like a place of refuge, a pocket of profound stillness. The urge to change back was overwhelming, a need to be in her own skin to process the terror of being hunted. She landed softly on the soft moss inside the great trunk and let the crow's form melt away, the process smoother now, a practiced unclenching of a fist she hadn't realized she was holding. She was Elara again, huddled in the cool, dim quiet, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she listened for the sound of hooves. But the only sound was the drip of water and the beat of her own heart. The silence was absolute, and in that silence, the memory surfaced. It didn't come as a thought, but as a sensation, a phantom chill, the ghost of rough, damp stone beneath her small hands, the echo of a voice that was both hers and not hers, singing a fragment of a tune in a language she had never learned but somehow understood. The memory was attached to this place, to this very hollow tree. It was a memory that did not belong to her. A wave of dizziness washed over her, a disorienting sense of double vision. She saw the crumbling interior of the tree, but she also saw it whole and strong, vibrant with life, a sapling in a sunlit grove. The sensation was so vivid, so overpowering, that she reached out and pressed her palm flat against the interior wall of the ruin. And the world dissolved. She was not Elara. She was someone else, older, her hands gnarled and strong, her skin the texture of bark. She felt a deep, resonant connection to the tree around her, not as a shelter, but as a part of herself. She could feel the slow, patient pulse of its life, the stretch of its roots deep into the dark earth, the whisper of the wind through its leaves, which were also, in some way, her own thoughts. A profound sorrow filled her, a grief for a loss so vast it could encompass the world. She was singing, a low, humming dirge for the green, living things that were fading, their songs being silenced one by one. She was pouring her own essence, her memories, her very song into the heartwood of this tree, a final act of preservation before the great silence took her. The language was one of root and rain, of sun and season, and she understood it perfectly. The vision snapped, tearing away with the force of a physical blow. Elara stumbled backward, collapsing onto the moss, her head ringing, her senses reeling. She was herself again, but the echo of the ancient being's sorrow lingered in her chest, a hollow, aching weight. She looked at her own hands, expecting to see bark, but seeing only girl skin, trembling. She had not just remembered, she had relived. She had not just changed her own shape, she had somehow stepped into the lingering memory of another consciousness, a creature so fundamentally different from anything she knew. The old woman's words came back to her with terrifying new meaning. Your changing is not a curse. It is a language. This was a new dialect. This wasn't about wearing a skin. It was about listening to the echo a life had left on the world. It was about memory that was not her own. The fear of the hunters was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a vast, terrifying awe. She was a shifter, and she was only just beginning to understand what that truly meant. The world was not just filled with forms she could wear, but with stories she could somehow inhabit. And some of those stories were ancient, sorrowful, and waiting. The echo of the ancient memory lingered like a scent after rain, a profound sorrow that was not her own yet felt etched into her bones. Elara remained curled in the mossy hollow of the great tree, trying to steady her breathing, to separate her own panic from the tree song's dirge. The hunters, the blight-stone, her own exile, all of it momentarily receded before the staggering implication of what had just happened. She could do more than mimic life. She could touch its echoes. The thought was as terrifying as it was fascinating. A sharp, cracking sound, the report of a snapped branch, shattered the deep silence of the grove. It was too close, too deliberate to be an animal. Fear, her own this time, surged back, cold and immediate. They had found her. The crow's instinct screamed for flight, but the canopy here was too thick, too tangled. The badger's defiance rose in her throat, but a fight against armed men was suicide. Her mind raced through her limited catalogue of forms, rejecting each one. Then she saw it, nestled in a patch of damp earth between two great roots, a thick, knotted vine of common ivy, its leaves dark and glossy. It was a part of the background, utterly insignificant. An idea, desperate and insane, bloomed in her mind. The old woman had said it was a language. Could she speak not just of flesh and blood, but of wood and leaf? Could she become something that wasn't animal? The effort was entirely different. It wasn't a flow of muscle and bone, but a slow, rigid hardening, a settling. She focused on the ivy's patient, grasping nature, its simple purpose to climb and cover and exist. She pushed her consciousness into that idea, willing her own frantic energy to still, to become passive, to become green. The change was not a shift but a settling, a rooting. Her skin prickled not with fur but with a rough, fibrous texture, darkening to a deep brown green. Her limbs stiffened, stretching and thinning into pliable stems, her fingers branching into small, questing tendrils. Her hair seemed to melt and reform into a cascade of dark, heart-shaped leaves. Her perspective didn't shift to a new set of eyes, it simply faded. She didn't see so as sense, the quality of light on her leaves, the moisture in the air, the solid presence of the ancient tree against her new-grown vines. She was aware, but it was a slow, patient awareness, a consciousness measured in sunlight and rainfall, not in heartbeats. She was Elara, but she was also Ivy, and the two states existed in a strange, quiet harmony of absolute stillness. The two hunters entered the clearing, their movements sharp and predatory against the deep, slow life of the grove. The man with the device held it before him. Its brass components were still now, the crystals dark and dormant. The signal was strongest here, he said, his voice a harsh grating in the profound quiet. He swept the device in an arc. It emitted a low, frustrated hum as it passed over the hollow of the great tree, directly over Elara's ivy-clad form, but the sound remained faint, confused. It's fading. Interference from this place, perhaps. The old magic here is thick. His companion, a woman with a scar tracing her jawline, scanned the clearing with sharp, dismissive eyes. She looked right at the patch of ivy, her gaze passing over it without a flicker of recognition. There's nothing here but rot and silence, she stated, her tone bored. The tracker must be faulty. The shifter wouldn't hide in a place like this. The energy would drive a thing like that mad. She kicked at a mushroom, sending it exploding into a cloud of spores. It's probably miles away by now, running like the scared animal it is. They lingered for a few more minutes, the man frustratedly tapping his device, the woman growing increasingly impatient. To Elara, their movement was a frantic, meaningless scurrying, their voices like the brief chattering of insects. She existed on a different scale of time. The sun moved a fraction in the sky. A beetle crawled across one of her leaves. She held the form, not through effort, but through a profound surrender to the ivy's nature. Finally, with a dismissive snort, the woman turned. We're wasting time. The trail goes cold here. We'll circle back and pick it up by the bog. The man nodded reluctantly, casting one last look around the clearing before following her out. Their footsteps faded, and the deep, ancient silence of the grove settled back into place. Elara held the form for a long time after they were gone, until the setting sun cast long, deep shadows through the trees. Only then, slowly, carefully, did she will herself back. The unrooting was a strange, peeling sensation, like shedding a second skin made of bark and sap. She returned to her human form kneeling on the moss, gasping as if breaking the surface after a long dive, her senses rushing back in a dizzying wave. She had done it. She had become something not animal. She had hidden in plain sight. She had understood a new word in the language of her changing. But the victory felt hollow. The hunter's words echoed in her mind. The shifter wouldn't hide in a place like this. The energy would drive a thing like that mad. They saw her as a thing, an animal. And the ivy's stillness had shown her something else. She was connected to the old magic they despised. She was not just running from hunters. She was caught between two worlds, understood by neither. The path to Veridia seemed longer and more lonely than ever. The profound, vegetative stillness of the ivy form left a strange aftereffect, a sluggishness in her human blood that made the world feel too loud, too fast, too sharp. Uncurling her stiff limbs, Elara stumbled from the sanctuary of the hollow tree, the hunter's words, a thing like that, echoing in the newly frantic rhythm of her heart. They saw her as a beast to be tracked, an anomaly to be purged. The old woman and the tree's memory spoke of something else, something older and more complex, but that path felt shrouded in a mist of sorrow and incomprehensible weight. She was caught between, belonging to neither, and the loneliness of it was a colder chill than the evening air. She needed to move, to put more distance between herself and the hunters who thought her fled. But the encounter had drained her, not just physically, but in a deeper, more fundamental way. The fear was a constant companion now, a gnawing rat in the pit of her stomach, and the vast, darkening wood seemed to feed on it, every shadow stretching into a potential threat. She couldn't face another transformation, not yet. Her human feet, clumsy and slow, would have to suffice. She walked until the last of the light bled from the sky, her path a meandering stumble through the undergrowth, guided only by the stubborn insistence of East. When the darkness became absolute and her legs refused to carry her further, she found a shallow depression beneath the exposed roots of a lightning-blasted pine, a miserable excuse for shelter. Curling into a ball, she wrapped Kale's spare tunic tighter around herself, but the coarse fabric was no match for the deepening cold that seeped up from the ground. This was the reality of her exile: hunger, exhaustion, and a cold that bit down to the marrow. The fear began to curdle into something darker, a bleak and suffocating despair. What was the point? She was a thing, an it. Her father had sent her away to be safe, but safety was a mirage. The hunters had devices that could sense her very nature. The world was poisoned with blight-stones that twisted life into nightmare. She was alone, and she was going to die out here, cold and forgotten, her body just another piece of the forest's rot. The thoughts circled, vultures picking at the edges of her sanity. She was so focused on the internal spiral of dread that she almost missed the soft crunch of a footfall nearby. Her head snapped up, every muscle tensing, her breath catching in her throat. Had they come back? Was it a wolf, drawn by her weakness? She peered into the blackness, seeing nothing, but hearing the sound again, closer this time. A low, rumbling growl vibrated through the stillness, not aggressive, but inquisitive, a question posed in a language of threat and curiosity. Then, 2 points of soft, phosphorescent green light appeared in the darkness, hovering at the height of a large dog's eyes. They blinked slowly. A shape resolved itself from the shadows, a great, sleek wolf, its fur so black it seemed to drink the scant starlight. But this was no ordinary wolf. Those glowing eyes held an intelligence that was ancient and deep, and as it stepped closer, Elara saw strange, faint markings like swirling silver tattoos barely visible along its flanks. It stopped a few paces away, its head cocked. It did not snarl. It did not advance to attack. It simply regarded her. And then, the voice came. It wasn't a sound that traveled through the air, but a resonance that formed directly inside her mind, a thought that was not her own, its texture rough and warm like sun-baked stone. The little ember burns low. Elara froze, too terrified even to tremble. Was she hallucinating from hunger and fear? The cold and the dark whisper lies, the voice continued, the meaning unfolding within her consciousness. They say you are alone. They say you are nothing. They are wrong. The wolf, the creature, took another step closer, and then it did something utterly unexpected. It lay down, curling its massive body between her and the open forest, its glowing eyes still fixed on her. A wave of warmth radiated from it, not the heat of a fire, but a deep, living warmth that pushed back the biting cold. Rest, little shifter. The pack watches. The words were not an offer, but a simple statement of fact. The paralyzing terror did not vanish, but it was now mixed with a shock so profound it left no room for despair. This creature could speak inside her head. It knew what she was. And it was protecting her. She stared into those luminous green eyes, seeing no malice, only a calm, immense patience. This was not the mindless rage of the blighted wolf. This was something else entirely. Hesitantly, slowly, she uncoiled from her defensive ball. The warmth emanating from the great wolf was irresistible. She was still afraid, but a deeper, more primal instinct recognized that this was not a threat. This was shelter. This was watchfulness. She lay back down, the cold ground now noticeably warmer near the creature's bulk. She did not sleep, but she rested, her body slowly unwinding from its tight coil of fear. She was not alone. The words echoed the old woman's, but they felt different coming from this majestic, silent guardian. The world was vast and filled with terrors she could not comprehend, but it was also filled with wonders. And for this one long night, a wonder had chosen to stand between her and the darkness. The despair receded, not gone, but held at bay by the simple, undeniable reality of the pack that watched. The wolf's warmth was a tangible force, a barrier against the night's deepening chill and the despair that had threatened to consume her. Elara lay in a state of suspended animation, not quite sleeping, not quite awake, her consciousness tethered to the slow, steady rhythm of the great creatures breathing beside her. The voice in her mind had fallen silent, leaving behind only a profound, watchful presence. She was not alone. The truth of it was a fragile, glowing ember in the vast dark, and she clung to it. As the first hint of grey diluted the blackness overhead, the wolf stirred. It rose to its feet with a fluid, powerful grace that spoke of unimaginable strength, its luminous eyes regarding her once more. The internal voice resonated again, gentle but firm. The sun's eye opens. Your path lies east, little ember. Follow the water song. It will lead you to the stone that sings, and then to the man plains. Before she could form a question, a thought, or even a proper thank you, the wolf turned and melted into the fading shadows between the trees, its dark form disappearing as completely as if it had been a dream. The sudden absence of its warmth and presence was a physical shock, leaving her colder and more exposed than before it had come. But it had left something behind, a direction. Follow the water song. She pushed herself up, her body stiff and aching, but her spirit strangely lighter. The command was not a vague notion of east anymore, it was a specific instruction tied to the world around her. She listened, pushing her human senses to their limit, and faintly, beneath the morning chatter of waking birds, she heard it, the persistent, gentle murmur of a stream. She moved towards the sound, her hunger a dull ache overshadowed by this new purpose. The stream was clear and swift, cutting a cheerful path through the solemn wood. This, then, was the water song. She drank deeply, the cold water clearing the last cobwebs of fear from her mind, and began to follow its bank downstream. The wolf's words played in her head. The stone that sings. What could that mean? The memory of the blight-stone, cold and dead and wrong, was a stark contrast to the idea of a singing stone. This, she felt, would be something life-giving, not life-taking. The journey was easier with the stream as her guide. The land gradually sloped downward, the trees beginning to thin, and the character of the forest changed from deep, ancient wildwood to a lighter, more open woodland. The water song grew louder, joined by another sound, a deep, resonant hum that was felt in the bones more than heard by the ears. It was a vibration that grew stronger with every step, a thrumming energy that made the air itself seem to shimmer. And then she saw it. The stream cascaded over a series of ledges into a wide, clear pool. And in the center of that pool, thrusting up from the water like a natural altar, was a standing stone. It was twice her height, made of a pale, almost milky quartz shot through, with veins of gleaming silver. And it was singing. The sound was a low, beautiful chord that seemed to emanate from the stone itself, a harmonic resonance that vibrated through the water, the air, and the very rock beneath her feet. It was a sound of profound peace, of ancient stability, of a deep and abiding connection to the world. It was the absolute opposite of the hateful silence of the blight-stone. Without conscious thought, drawn by a pull she could not resist, Elara waded into the pool. The water was shockingly cold, but the stone's song seemed to warm her from the inside. She reached out, her fingertips trembling, and laid her palm flat against the smooth, sun-warmed surface of the quartz. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. It was not a memory, not a vision like the tree. It was a pure, undiluted sensation of rightness, a feeling of being perfectly, utterly in balance. The chaotic chorus of urges inside her, the bird's desire for flight, the fox's cunning, the badger's rage, even the ivy's patience, all fell into a harmonious silence. For the first time since the rabbit's heart had been her whole world, the frantic noise in her soul stilled. There was no push to change, no fear of losing control. There was only a perfect, peaceful stillness. She was just Elara, and that was enough. She didn't know how long she stood there, hand on the stone, bathed in its healing song. It could have been minutes or hours. When she finally withdrew her hand, the song continued to resonate within her, a quiet hum in her blood. The world looked the same, but she felt fundamentally different. Centered. The path ahead was no less dangerous, the hunters no less a threat, but the paralyzing fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. She looked east, beyond the pool. The trees ended not far ahead, giving way to rolling, sun-drenched grasslands that stretched to the horizon. The Man Plains. Veridia was somewhere out there, a city of noise where she could lose herself. But as she waded out of the pool, her clothes dripping, she knew she wouldn't just be hiding anymore. She was a shifter. The stone had not erased that. It had shown her its true nature, beneath the fear. It was a language of life, and she had just learned a word for peace. She began to walk, leaving the water's song and the stone that sings behind, her steps firmer on the path, the wolf's gift and the stone's harmony acquired strength inside her as she stepped out of the forest and into the vast, open unknown. The song of the stone faded to a cherished hum in her veins, a quiet anchor in the vast, disorienting openness that now stretched before her. The whispering wood was a solid, dark line at her back, a world of secrets and shelter she had left behind. Ahead, the grasslands, the Man Plains, rolled away in great, golden swells under an immense bowl of sky. The scale of it was breathtaking and utterly terrifying. In the forest, danger had hidden behind trees. Here, it could see you coming from miles away. The sun, a fierce and impartial eye, beat down upon her, and the wind swept across the plains with a constant, sighing whisper, carrying the sense of dry earth, dust, and endless space. Her human form felt achingly small and exposed. Every instinct she'd honed in the wood screamed at her to find cover, to become something that could hide in this new, vertical world. But what? The fox or badger would be just as visible. The crow would be a solitary speck in an empty sky, a beacon for any watching eye. The peace from the singing stone was a warmth in her chest, but it did not silence the practical need for survival. She walked for hours, the sun climbing to its zenith, her shadow a small puddle at her feet. The sameness of the landscape was a form of torture, one grassy hill looked exactly like the last, and her progress felt illusory. Thirst became a rasping dryness in her throat, the water from the stream a distant memory. This was a different kind of test, not of sudden terror, but of slow, grinding exposure. It was in this state of weary, sun-dazed desperation that she crested another rise and saw the first true sign of other people. A lonely, weather-beaten wagon, its canvas cover in tatters, sitting crookedly beside the ruts of a dirt track that could barely be called a road. A single old horse, its head hung low, stood swishing its tail at flies. It was a picture of broken-down exhaustion. As she drew closer, her heart thudding with a mixture of hope and caution, she saw the owner. An old man was on his knees beside one of the wagon's large wheels, which was buried up to its axle in a patch of deceptively soft mud. He was tugging at it with raw, bleeding hands, his breaths coming in ragged, hopeless grunts. He hadn't heard her approach. Elara stopped, uncertain. Her father's warning, "Trust no one," warred with the ingrained decency of her upbringing. He was just an old man. And he was clearly defeated. "Do you need help?" The words were out of her mouth before she could stop them, her voice rough from disuse and dust. The man started violently, scrambling back and looking up at her with wide, surprised eyes set in a face leathered by sun and wind. He looked her up and down, taking in her worn clothes, her youth, her aloneness out in the middle of nowhere. A flicker of suspicion crossed his features, but it was quickly washed away by a wave of resigned frustration. "Help," he barked, a dry, humorless laugh. "Unless you're a draft horse in disguise, girl, I doubt it. The damn axles stuck fast. Spend my strength for nothing." He gestured helplessly at the wheel. A draft horse. The thought arrived fully formed, a solution so obvious and practical it bypassed all fear. She didn't have to be a girl trying to push a wagon. She could be the strength itself. The singing stone's peace had quieted the chaos, allowing for a choice that was not born of panic, but of simple necessity. "Wait here," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. Before the old man could question her, she ducked behind the relative cover of the wagon's listing side. She focused on the image of the patient, powerful plow horses from her village, their immense shoulders, their steady, unquestioning strength. The change was swift and solid, a feeling of her form thickening, growing dense and immensely strong. Her skin hardened, becoming a familiar leathery hide, her hands and feet becoming solid hooves planted firmly on the earth. In moments, a sturdy, dun-colored draft horse stood where the girl had been. She shook her great head, the harness feeling alien but not uncomfortable, and stepped out from behind the wagon. The old man's eyes bulged. He stared, his mouth working soundlessly. He looked from the empty spot where the girl had vanished to the horse that had appeared. He stumbled backward, crossing himself with a trembling hand. By the gods, a spirit, a trick, Elara, the horse, ignored his terror. She had a job to do. She lowered her massive shoulder against the stuck wheel, positioning herself as she'd seen the farm horses do 1,000 times. She braced her powerful legs and pushed. Muscle, real and immense and borrowed, strained. The wagon groaned, the mud sucked greedily at the wheel, and then, with a great wet gasp, it came free, rolling onto solid ground. The moment it was loose, she turned and walked back behind the wagon, willing the change back to her human self. It was effortable, like stepping out of a heavy, warm coat. She emerged a moment later, breathing heavily, her human frame feeling terribly fragile after. The horse's strength. The old man was still on the ground, staring at her as if she'd grown a second head. His fear was palpable. Elara brushed the dust from her trousers, avoiding his eyes. "Your wheel is free," she said quietly. She didn't wait for a response. She turned and began to walk away, following the dusty track east, her heart hammering. She had helped, and she had been seen. But this time, the fear on his face wasn't met with her own shame. It was met with a strange, quiet sense of resolve. She had used her curse to do a good thing. It was a small thing, but in the vast, empty plains, it felt immensely significant. She was learning the language, and she had just spoken a word for strength. The old man's stunned, fearful gaze felt like a physical pressure between her shoulder blades long after the crooked wagon and its weary horse had shrunk to a speck and then vanished behind the rolling hills. He would have a story to tell now, a tale of a spirit horse girl on the plains, a story that would likely be dismissed as the ramblings of a sun-addled old man. But it was a risk. Every change was a risk. The encounter, however, had left a new residue on her soul, different from the fear or the wonder before it, a faint, tentative sense of agency. She had chosen to help. She had used the power, not just to flee or hide, but to do something. The singing stone's harmony and that single act of strength wove together inside her, a fragile cord of confidence. The dusty track eventually merged with a proper road, a wide ribbon of hard-packed earth rutted by the passage of countless carts and travelers. It was the first undeniable proof that she was moving towards a world of people, not away from it. Veridia was out here, somewhere. The road should have been a comfort, a guidepost. Instead, with every step, her newfound calm began to erode, worn away by a rising tide of sheer sensory overload. The world was too loud. After the deep silences of the forest and the empty whisper of the plains, the road was a chaotic assault. Carts laden with goods rattled past, their drivers shouting curses or greetings she didn't understand. Groups of pilgrims sang hymns with ragged devotion. Merchants argued over prices, their voices sharp and grating. The clatter of wheels, the braying of mules, the sheer press of fragmented conversations, it all crashed into her, a meaningless, overwhelming roar. And the smells. She had thought the forest was rich with scent, but that was a natural tapestry, each thread distinct. Here, it was a foul, thick soup. The reek of unwashed bodies and animal sweat, the acrid tang of dung from the countless beasts of burden, the pungent odor of cheap oil and fried food from roadside stalls, all mingled into a stifling haze that made her want to gag. Her senses, still heightened from a life spent half in animal form, had no filter for this human onslaught. It was agony. She kept her head down, pulling the hood of her tunic up to shadow her face, and tried to make herself small and invisible, just one more dusty traveler in the endless stream. But she felt like a raw nerve, flayed open and dragging through the noise and the stench. Every shouted word was a potential threat, every glance in her direction a moment of heart-stopping panic. The urge to change, to become something that could flee this torrent of humanity, was a constant, screaming pressure in her skull. To become the crow and fly above it. To become the fox and dart into the ditch. But that would be suicide. Here, surrounded by hundreds of eyes, any change would be her end. So she endured. She walked, her muscles clenched tight, her breath shallow, a terrified animal trapped in a human-shaped cage. The piece from the singing stone was a distant memory, a tiny, cool pebble at the bottom of a boiling ocean of anxiety. She was Elara, and she was drowning in the world of men. It was in this state of shattering overload that she felt it again. A vibration, faint but unmistakable, a wrongness that cut through the chaotic noise like a thin, cold needle. It was the same frequency she'd felt from the hunter's device in the forest, the same metallic hum that had resonated with the crow's bones. Her head snapped up, her eyes scanning the crowd frantically. And then she saw them. They weren't on horseback here. They were on foot, moving against the flow of traffic with a predator's lazy confidence. Two of them. They wore the same dark leathers, but now covered by dusty travel cloaks, doing little to blend in with the ragged pilgrims and farmers. One of them held the device, smaller now, palmed in his hand, but she could see the occasional glint of brass as his fingers shifted. He was sweeping it slowly back and forth, his eyes narrowed in concentration as he sifted through the crowd. They were hunting. Here, on the open road, in the midst of all these people. They were so brazen, so certain of their right to be there, to sift through humanity for their prey. Her. They were looking for her. Pure, undiluted terror locked her muscles. She stood frozen in the middle of the stream of people, a stone against the current. They were getting closer, the man with the device frowning as the hum seemed to intensify, his gaze starting to sweep in her direction. She was a beacon. She was going to be found. Right here, right now. The little ember burns low. The wolf's words from the cold night flashed in her mind. The cold and the dark whisper lies. They say you are alone. They are wrong. The panic crested, and in its wake came a desperate, crazy clarity. She could not run. She could not fight. She could not hide. The only way was to stop being a beacon. To douse the ember. To become not an animal, not a plant, but one of them. To disappear into the very thing that was overwhelming her. She focused on the women around her. A farmer's wife with a weary slump to her shoulders. A merchant's daughter with a haughty tilt to her chin. A dozen different faces, ages, sizes. She didn't need to become a specific person. She needed to become an idea, anonymous, unremarkable, human. She poured every ounce of will into it, not into changing her shape, but into muting the fire inside, into making her spirit small and dull and ordinary. The man with the device was looking right at her. His eyes met hers across the crowd. For a heart-stopping second, she saw a flicker of recognition, a triumph in his gaze. He took a step toward her, and then his device emitted a low, frustrated sputter. The light in its crystal died. He frowned, shaking it, tapping it sharply. He looked back at her, but his gaze was now confused, searching. It slid over her, past her, no longer seeing the shifter, just another dirty, wide-eyed girl on the road. Nothing to see here. He said something to his partner, his tone irritated, and they shouldered their way past, continuing down the line, their quest momentarily frustrated. Elara didn't move. She stood there, shaking, the noise and stench of the road crashing back over her. She had not changed her skin, but she had changed something deeper. She had hidden the core of what she was. She had spoken a new, desperate word in the language of her changing, a word for nothing. For nobody. She finally started walking again, her legs weak. She was still surrounded, still exposed, still terrified. But she was still free. She had passed through the hunter's net without moving a muscle. The lesson was as terrifying as it was liberating. Her greatest weapon wasn't the claw or the wing. It was the ability to become. Utterly, completely, Uninterestingly human, the road became her world, a river of dust and desperation flowing inexorably toward a horizon that never seemed to get any closer. The sheer press of humanity was a constant, grinding weight, a stark contrast to the solitary terror of the forest. Here, the danger was diffuse, 1,000 potential threats in every curious glance or shouted word. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a sun that baked the road into a hard, cracked ribbon. She learned to walk with the weary slump of the other refugees, to keep her eyes on the feet of the person in front of her, to become a gray, unnoticed smudge in the great moving tapestry of the displaced. The food she had taken from Kale's home was long gone, and hunger became a sharp-toothed companion, gnawing at her insides with a relentless ache. She learned to scavenge, a bruised apple discarded from a merchant's cart, a handful of grain spilled from a sack, once even the half-gnawed crust of bread she wrestled from a stray dog, the badger's fury flashing in her eyes for a second before she choked it down, shame burning her throat worse than the dry bread. Thirst was a worse torment. The communal water barrels at the infrequent way stations were often fought over, and she was too small, too weak to push her way to the front. It was after 2 days without a proper drink, her head swimming with heat and dizziness, that she stumbled upon a miracle. A small, neglected shrine to some forgotten road deity, its statue cracked and mossy, but at its base was a shallow stone basin collecting rainwater from a rusty gutter. The water was warm and tasted of metal and leaves, but to her it was the sweetest nectar. She drank greedily, cupping her hands again and again, pouring it over her head, washing the grime from her face. It was only as her thirst was slaked that she noticed the others. A group of children, 5 or 6 of them, huddled in the scant shade of the shrine. They were thinner than she was, their eyes huge in the dirty faces, watching her every move with a desperate, avian intensity. The youngest, a boy who couldn't have been more than 4, let out a dry, hacking cough that shook his entire tiny frame. They had no waterskin, no container of any kind. They had been waiting for her to finish. Without a word, Elara stepped back from the basin. The oldest girl, a child with a fierce, protective light in her eyes, darted forward and helped the little boy drink, using her own hands as a cup. The others followed suit, a silent, orderly ritual of survival. Elara stood there, a strange ache in her chest that had nothing to do with hunger. She looked at their hollow cheeks, their bony shoulders. Without thinking, she reached into the small pouch at her belt, the one that held the old woman's stone and nothing else, and pretended to rummage. She closed her fingers around the cool, veined rock and focused, not on an animal, but on the memory of the journey cake from Kale's home. She thought of its dense, gritty texture, its faint sweetness, its nourishing weight. She poured that thought, that memory, into the stone, willing it to become. She felt a subtle shift, not in her own body, but in the object in her hand, a slight warming, a change in density. She pulled her hand out, and where the grey stone had been, there was now a rough, oat-based journey cake, identical to the one she had taken. She held it out to the fierce-eyed girl. The girl stared at it, then at Elara's empty pouch, then back at the food. Suspicion and desperate need warred on her face. Finally, need won. She snatched the cake, broke it into 5 meticulous pieces, and distributed them to the others before taking the smallest piece for herself. They ate in silence, their eyes never leaving Elara. She had done it. She had changed something outside of herself. The effort left her feeling lightheaded, drained in a way that physical transformation never did, but the look in their eyes, not fear, not wonder, but simple, profound gratitude, was a warmth that fought back the cold loneliness inside her. She gave them a faint, hesitant smile before turning to leave. As she walked away, she heard the little boy's voice, small and clear, say, "Thank you, bread lady." The title, so absurd and so perfect, settled over her shoulders not as a burden, but as a cloak. She was no longer just a shifter, a monster, a thing. She was also the bread lady. And that was a self she thought she might be able to bear. The road ahead still stretched to infinity, but her steps felt a little lighter. The title, Bread Lady, was a fragile, precious thing, a small warm coal cupped in her hands against the vast cold of her journey. It lasted for 3 more days. 3 days of walking in the dust-choked wake of carts, of sleeping fitfully in ditches, of feeling her humanity worn down to a thin, brittle shell. The memory of the children's gratitude was a beacon, but it couldn't compete with the gnawing reality of her own escalating hunger. The effort of transforming the stone had taken something from her, a deep, spiritual tax, and her body demanded payment in calories she did not have. The world began to take on a sharp, hyper-real quality, colors too bright, sounds too sharp, the line between her own thoughts and the whispered instincts of the forms within her starting to blur dangerously. She was fading. It was on the 4th day that the road began to change. The traffic grew thicker, more frenetic. The simple wooden signposts were replaced by stone markers carved with increasingly complex directions. The air, once carrying the simple scents of earth and animals, now carried a new, strange smell, a metallic tang, like lightning and hot glass, undercut by the ever-present stink of too many people. And on the horizon, a smudge that had been a hazy promise for days began to resolve itself into something impossible. Veridia. It wasn't a city as she understood it. It was a mountain range forged not of stone, but of ambition. Spires of pale granite and gleaming copper pierced the sky, their tops lost in the smoky haze. Walls that seemed to stretch for miles encircled it, and even from this distance, she could see the ant-like flow of humanity through its massive gates. It was immense, overwhelming, terrifying. It was also her only goal. A final, desperate energy surged in her. She was almost there. She pushed forward, her hunger forgotten in the face of this colossal terminus. But the world had one more horror to show her. The road here was flanked by desperate camps, a shantytown of the hopeless who could not gain entry to the city or had been broken by it. The air was thick with the smell of despair and unwashed bodies. And it was here, on the very threshold of her destination, that she saw it. A cage, crude and made of rusted iron, sat near the edge of the encampment. A crowd had gathered around it, not in pity, but in a morbid, jeering curiosity. And inside the cage was a boy. He was perhaps her age, thin and filthy, but that wasn't what made the crowd point and gasp. His skin was shifting, not like hers, in whole, controlled transformations, but in a chaotic, involuntary ripple. One moment his arm was covered in coarse, brown fur, the next it was scaled and reptilian, then it would be human again, all in a nauseating, uncontrolled cycle. He was trembling, his eyes wide with a terror so absolute it was beyond screaming. He was a shifter, like her, but he had no control. None at all. The changes were seizures, a body at war with itself, a soul being torn apart in public for a few coppers' entertainment. A man, fat and sweating, was taking bets from the crowd on what the boy would become next. "See the beast boy," he crowed, a spectacle of nature's mistake. Lyra stood frozen, the world narrowing to that cage, to that boy's terrified, rolling eyes. This was what they saw when they looked at her. This was the thing the hunters tracked, the demon the villagers feared. This raw, painful, public display of losing oneself was the nightmare that had haunted her since the rabbit's heart. This was her fate, if she were ever caught. The bread lady was annihilated. The fragile piece from the singing stone shattered. The fear returned, not as a chill, but as a white-hot brand searing through her veins. Her own control, so hard won, felt like a ludicrous joke, a thin sheet of ice over a bottomless ocean of this same chaos. She stumbled back from the crowd, away from the cage, away from the boy's silent scream, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She turned and ran, not toward the city gates, but away, parallel to the immense wall, blind with a panic more profound than any she had ever known. She ran until the jeering crowd was gone, until she found a narrow, stinking alley between two leaning shacks that offered a sliver of shadow. She collapsed there, behind a pile of rotting refuse, curling into a tight ball, wrapping her arms around her head as if to physically hold herself together. The boy's shifting, twitching form was burned onto the backs of her eyelids. Her own skin prickled and crawled, every form within her stirring in sympathetic agony, threatening to break free in the same terrible, public way. She was at the finish line, and it was a nightmare. She was so close to losing everything. The city loomed above her, not a sanctuary, but a hungry mouth, and she was just another piece of meat waiting to be devoured. The stink of the alley, rotting food, human waste, and despair, was a thick, suffocating blanket, but Elara pressed herself deeper into it, into the narrow space between a crumbling mud brick wall and a stinking midden pile. It was a pathetic hiding place, a rat's nest, but it was all she had. The image of the boy in the cage played behind her eyes on a nightmarish loop, his body betraying him in a public spectacle of agony. That was her. That was what she was. Every instinct screamed to change, to become something small and unseen, to burrow into the filth and never come out. But the fear of losing control, of her own body becoming that chaotic, twitching horror show, was even stronger. She was trapped, paralyzed in her own skin, shaking uncontrollably. The grand, imposing gate of Veridia was visible from the mouth of the alley, a monument to order and civilization that now seemed like the entrance to a slaughterhouse. She could never walk through there. They would see her for what she was. They would put her in a cage. The day wore on, the shadows in the alley lengthening. Her hunger and thirst, forgotten in the blind panic, returned with a vengeful intensity, sharp claws scraping at her insides. She was back to the very beginning, a scared animal, alone and starving, with nowhere to run. It was the sound of clinking metal that finally pierced her stupor. Not the heavy clash of armor, but a lighter, more rhythmic sound. Peering through a crack in the wall, she saw a figure, a young woman with a soot-smudged face and tired eyes, dragging a handcart piled with scrap metal and broken tools. She was heading not for the main gate, but for a smaller, meaner-looking postern gate set into the Great Wall a few hundred yards away. This gate was less guarded, used by tradesfolk and the city's underclass, a stream of ragged people flowing in and out under the bored gaze of a single city watchman. This was it, not the grand entrance, but the back door, a way in for those who were beneath notice. But she couldn't go as she was. Her face was known to the hunters. Her very nature was a beacon. The lesson from the road, the desperate act of making herself nothing, was her only weapon. She had to become one of them, not just in spirit, but in truth. She focused on the scrap metal woman, on the other downtrodden souls shuffling through the gate. She thought of their weariness, their resignation, the layers of grime and hardship that were their real armor. She didn't try to become a specific person, she tried to become the essence of unremarkable. She called upon the change, but directed it inward, muting the brilliant, dangerous ember of her spirit, damping down the energy that resonated with the hunter's device. She let her shoulders slump further, let a chronic cough settle in her chest, made her eyes dull and vacant. She rubbed dirt into her skin and hair, not as a disguise, but as a truth. She became less than she was. She became no one. Then, moving with the sluggish apathy of the truly exhausted, she shuffled out of the alley and merged with the flow of people heading for the postern gate. She kept her head down, her eyes on the cracked heels of the man in front of her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat screaming its betrayal of her outer calm. She could feel the watchman's gaze sweep over her, a moment of unbearable scrutiny. She expected a shout, a rough hand on her shoulder, but his gaze moved on, bored. She was just another piece of human driftwood washing into the city. She passed under the thick stone archway, and the world changed. The immense wall behind her cut off the open sky, and she was plunged into the roaring, chaotic heart of Veridia. The noise was a physical force, a solid wall of sound, shouting vendors, clanging workshops, barking dogs, the rumble of countless feet on cobblestones. The smell was even worse than the road, a concentrated, suffocating melange of sewage, smoke, cooking oil, and too many people living on top of one another. Buildings leaned precariously over narrow, filthy streets, cutting out the sun. It was overwhelming, terrifying, and for the first time since she'd seen the cage, she felt a flicker of something other than pure dread. She was inside. She had done it. She was a single drop in a vast, teeming ocean. She had become nobody in a city of nobodies. She stood there for a long moment, just inside the gate, buffeted by the crowd, letting the immense, roaring anonymity of the place wash over her. The hunters, the cage, the boy, they were out there, beyond the wall. In here, she was just one more face in the crowd. She was lost. She was safe. For now, the journey was over. A new one, far more complex and dangerous, had just begun. The roaring chaos of Veridia's outer districts was a smothering blanket, a cacophony of humanity so dense and loud it seemed to swallow individual sounds into one great, oppressive drone. Elara, though the name felt like a distant memory, a skin she'd shed on the road, pushed deeper into the maze of narrow, twisting alleys, away from the relative order of the gate. The buildings leaned in so close they nearly kissed overhead, strung with ragged laundry and crisscrossed with lines that offered glimpses of a smog-choked sky. The air was thick with the reek of offal, cheap coal smoke, and the unmistakable tang of despair. This was the Warrens, a place not found on any city map, a festering wound in the side of the gleaming city of spires she had seen from the road. Here, the rule of law was a distant rumor, and survival was the only currency. Her first need was shelter. A doorway offered a brief respite from the jostling crowd, but a sharp-eyed urchin warned her off with a hissed threat and a flash of a rusted shiv. An abandoned cellar smelled of disease and death. She was a foreign body in this ecosystem, and it was quick to reject her. Hunger was a sharper pain than ever, the smells of sizzling street food from questionable stalls a form of torture. She had nothing to trade, no coins, no skills anyone here would want. Except one. She found a blind corner where two walls met, creating a pocket of shadow deep enough to hide in. She focused on the memory of the journey cake, on the simple, life-sustaining weight of it. She held the old woman's stone, now cool and inert in her palm, and poured her will into it, focusing not on fear or flight, but on pure, desperate need. The change was slower this time, a draining effort that left her lightheaded. But when she opened her eyes, the stone was gone, and in its place was a small, hard loaf of black bread. It wasn't much, but it was food. She devoured half of it in ravenous bites, the stale crust scraping her throat, and hid the rest. It was a temporary reprieve. She couldn't live on transforming a single stone a day. As dusk began to bleed into the perpetual twilight of the alleyways, the true nature of the Warrens revealed itself. The desperate energy of the day shifted into something darker, more predatory. Figures moved in the shadows, transactions were made in hushed tones, and the air grew thick with a different kind of tension. She found a niche behind a stack of broken barrels, pulling a discarded piece of sacking over herself like a blanket, hoping it was enough to escape notice. It wasn't. She had been seen. The scrape of a boot on stone was her only warning before a hand clamped over her mouth, rough and smelling of grime, and another arm snaked around her waist, lifting her bodily from her hiding place. She struggled, but her strength was nothing against the wiry muscle of the two teenage boys who had grabbed her. They dragged her into a dead-end alley, dumping her on the ground before a third figure, a girl with hard eyes and a scar cutting through her lip. New meat, one of the boys grunted. The scarred girl looked Elara over with a dismissive sneer. She's nothing. Skin and bones. What's she got? One of them roughly patted her down, finding the remaining half loaf of bread and the empty pouch. He tossed the bread to the girl. This is it. The girl caught it, her sneer deepening. This is what you chose to defend. Pathetic. She took a bite of the bread. The Warrens eat the weak. You don't belong here. Everything you have is ours. Your spot is ours. You understand. You work for us, or you become dinner for the rats in the sump. This was it. This was the law of this place. Not to be ignored, but to be owned. To be prey. The fear was there, cold and sharp, but beneath it, something else stirred. Not the badger's rage or the fox's cunning, but the memory of the wolf's immense, calm power. The memory of the singing stone's balance. She was not just a girl to be bullied. She had a language they could not comprehend. As the larger boy reached down to grab her again, she didn't try to fight him off. Instead, she looked past him, into the deepest shadow of the alley, and she spoke the change. But not in her own body. She focused on the shadow itself, on the fear these rats carried in their own hearts. She poured her will into the form of the one thing that hunted even hunters in the dark. The air in the alley grew cold. A low, rumbling growl emanated from the darkness, a sound that promised violence and death. A pair of eyes, large and glowing with a feral yellow light, ignited in the blackness. Then another. The shape that emerged was a monstrous wolf, bigger than any natural beast, its form seeming to twist and shift at the edges, made of solid darkness and palpable menace. It was an illusion, a phantom woven from shadow and fear, but it was real enough to their eyes. The boys froze, their bravado evaporating into pure, pants-wetting terror. The scarred girl dropped the bread, her face a mask of horror. The phantom wolf took a step forward, its growl deepening, saliva dripping from jaws that could shred bone. They didn't wait for a second step. With choked cries of sheer panic, they turned and fled, scrambling over each other to escape the dead-end alley, their terror echoing down the narrow street. The moment they were gone, the illusion dissolved. The wolf vanished, the oppressive cold lifting. Elara slumped against the wall, trembling not with fear, but with the immense effort of the creation. She had not changed herself. She had changed the world around her. She had spoken a word of power into the very air. She was alone in the alley again. But she was no longer prey. She picked up the discarded half-loaf of bread, her hands steady. She had found her place in the warrens. She would not be owned. She would be the shadow in the alley. She would be the fear. She would survive. The phantom wolf's growl faded into the oppressive hum of the warrens, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the previous threat. Elara remained slumped against the cold, damp wall, her body trembling from the effort of a transformation that had taken nothing and made it into something terrifying. It was a new word in her language, one of pure illusion, and it had cost her dearly. The half-loaf of bread felt like a stone in her hand, but she forced herself to eat it, each dry mouthful a reclaiming of the territory she had just defended. The alley was hers now. The sacking behind the barrels became her castle. The fear she had projected became her invisible shield. Nights in the warrens were a different city. The frantic energy of survivalism gave way to a quieter, more sinister commerce. Whispers carried further, and the scuttling in the shadows was less often rats and more often people engaged in transactions that couldn't bear the light of day. It was from this nocturnal undercurrent that she first heard the term, spoken in a hushed, reverent tone by two figures sharing a stolen bottle of wine near the mouth of her alley. The serpent's kiss got him. Writhing like a worm on a hook, he was, before he just stopped. The other shuddered. Blight, take it. That's what comes of dealing with the wrong folks down in the sump. The sump. The name was spoken with a capital letter, a place of finality. She learned it was the lowest level of the warrens, a network of flooded tunnels and collapsed cellars where the city's waste eventually settled, and where those who had fallen too far to survive even the harsh mercy of the streets ended up. It was a place of no return. And it was where the blight take was happening. The term hooked into the memory of the wolf in the bog, the jagged shard of bruise-colored stone. Blight-stone. It wasn't just out in the wilds. It was here, in the city. It was being used. A new, cold curiosity took root alongside her fear. Days were for scavenging, for perfecting the small, sustaining transformations, turning a chip of wood into a nutrient-rich nut, a handful of stagnant water from a puddle into something marginally potable. But nights were for listening, for tracing the whispers about the sump and the serpent's kiss. She learned it was a poison, one that caused a painful, twisting death. And it was cheap. It was the preferred tool of settling scores in the underworld, untraceable and utterly feared. Her shelter, her alley, was near a grated drain that was one of the many entrances to the sump. The smell that wafted up from it was a complex cocktail of decay, stagnant water, and something else, something metallic and cold that made the forms inside her stir uneasily. It was the same scent from the bog. One night, driven by a need to understand the enemy that had haunted her from the beginning, she approached the grate. The iron bars were thick with rust and slime. Peering down into the darkness, she could see nothing but a faint, sickly greenish glow reflecting off black water far below. The wrongness was a physical pressure, a dissonant hum that set her teeth on edge. This was a place of death, but knowledge was a weapon. She focused her will, not on a large illusion, but on a small, precise change. She thought of the rats she heard skittering everywhere, their simple, ruthless purpose. Their immunity to the filth. She felt the familiar contraction, the world swelling as she shrank, her skin prickling with coarse gray fur. In moments, a large, sleek sewer rat stood where the girl had been. Her human mind, now housed in the rat's sharp senses, was immediately assaulted by the magnified stench. It was overwhelming, but beneath the organic decay, the cold, metallic tang of the blight was clear and distinct, a trail she could follow. She slipped easily between the rusted bars and dropped into the darkness. The sump was a nightmare world. She swam through icy, viscous water clotted with unspeakable things. The greenish glow came from patches of fungal growth that clung to the walls, pulsating softly. And then she found the source. In a partially collapsed tunnel, away from the main flow of water, was a cache. Crudely wrapped in oilcloth were several chunks of the same bruised dark, metallic stone she'd seen in the wolf. They bled their poison into the water, killing the slime and fungi around them, creating a halo of dead space. This was the heart of the serpent's kiss. This was the poison infecting the city. As she watched, a human figure, gaunt and desperate, emerged from a side tunnel. He looked furtively around, then chipped a small shard from one of the stones with a rusty chisel, wrapping it carefully before scurrying away. This was the distribution point. Her rat's heart hammered with a fear that was both animal and human. This was bigger than street gangs. This was an operation, and she was alone in the dark with it. She turned to flee, to bring this knowledge back to her alley, to her human form. But as she moved, her rat's tail brushed against one of the stones. It was not a physical shock, but a spiritual one. A wave of pure wrongness, a nullification of life, slammed through her. The rat form, a thing of instinct and survival, screamed in agony. The change back to human was not willed. It was a violent, reflexive rejection. It happened there, in the contaminated water. One moment she was a rat, the next she was a naked girl gasping and retching in the foul, blight-tainted water, the shock of the transformation and the poison's aura crashing over her in a nauseating wave. She scrambled back, slipping on the slimy tunnel floor, her human senses screaming at the intensified horror of the place. She had to get out. Now, she splashed towards the way she'd come, towards the faint light of the great high above. She was no longer a hidden observer. She was a girl, exposed and vulnerable, in the most dangerous place in the city. And she knew its secret. The climb out of the sump was a blind, desperate scramble, a fever dream of slime-slick walls and the chilling, metallic reek of the blight-stone burning in her lungs. She hauled herself through the grate, collapsing onto the filthy cobbles of her alley, naked, shivering, and vomiting stagnant water. The forms within her were a panicked storm, reacting to the poison's touch, each one screaming to be let out to flee the contamination. She clamped down with a will she didn't know she possessed, forcing herself to remain human, to remain Elara, even as her skin crawled with the memory of the rat's terror. She had seen the heart of the sickness. It wasn't just in the wilds. It was here, festering beneath the city, being harvested, weaponized. The knowledge was a weight that dwarfed her own fear of exposure. She could not hide in this alley anymore. The war she had been fleeing had already found its way inside the walls. The decision crystallized not in a moment of courage, but in a moment of utter, final exhaustion with being prey. She was tired of being the rabbit, the fox, the rat. The phantom wolf had been a whisper of a larger truth. She was more than what she could become. She was what she could unmake. Days bled into a single, focused purpose. She observed the comings and goings at the grate. She learned the rhythm of the desperate souls who harvested the blight-stone, the hollow-eyed man who came at twilight to collect their takings. She saw the casual evil of it, the way the poison leached into the harvesters themselves, leaving their hands raw and their eyes haunted. She did not try to stop them. She was one girl. Instead, she began to prepare. She found a vantage point on a crumbling rooftop overlooking the grate. She spent her last dregs of energy transforming stray bits of debris, a chip of brick, a discarded chicken bone, into sustenance, hoarding her strength for what was to come. She was no longer just surviving. She was an architect laying the groundwork for a single, defining act. The night arrived, thick and heavy with the city's rot. The harvester came, received his small, deadly parcel of wrapped stone, and left. The sump was quiet. This was the time. She climbed down into her alley for the last time. She stood before the grate, the entrance to the nightmare below. She did not change into a rat. She did not become a wolf. She closed her eyes and reached for the deepest, most fundamental part of her gift. She thought of the singing stone in the forest pool, its harmonic resonance, its pure, life-affirming song. She held that perfect note in her mind, a memory of balance and peace. And then she poured every ounce of her being. The rabbit's fear, the falcon's freedom, the badger's rage, the ivy's patience, the lynx's silence, the crow's cunning, the horse's strength, the wolf's guardianship, the human's love and loss, into that single, focused intention. She was not changing herself. She was changing the world. She directed the entirety of her power, the whole chaotic, glorious language of her soul, down into the darkness, towards the cache of blight-stone. She did not try to destroy it with force. She sought to change its song, to speak a word of life into the heart of death. A light, not of green fungus or reflected filth, but a clean, silver-white radiance, began to glow from the depths of the sump. It welled up through the grate, spilling into the alley, painting the grimy walls in tones of pure moonlight. A sound accompanied it, not a deafening explosion, but a deep, resonant chord that shook the very stones beneath her feet. The same chord from the standing stone, but magnified 1,000-fold, a note of such profound healing and finality that it silenced the constant noise of the warrens for 3 full heartbeats. The metallic reek of the blight vanished, replaced by the scent of ozone and clean rain. The light faded, the sound faded, the alley was dark again. But the world was different. Deep below, the blight-stone was no longer a poison. It was inert rock, its malevolent energy transmuted, neutralized by an act of impossible alchemy. The serpent's kiss was gone. Exhaustion such as she had never known claimed her. She slumped against the wall, utterly spent, her body hollowed out. She had poured everything she was into that single act. She felt ordinary. The constant whisper of other forms was silent. The urge to change was gone. She was just a girl, sitting in the dirt of a filthy alley. A figure stepped from the shadows. It was the old woman from the wood, her eyes reflecting a light that was no longer there. She looked at Elara not with pity, but with profound respect. "You spoke the last word," the woman said, her voice soft. "The word of making and unmaking. You have stilled a great wrong, little shifter. But such a word can only be spoken once." Elara looked up, too tired to even be surprised. "Is it gone? My gift?" "The storm is quiet," the woman said. "The ember burns steady. You are no longer a shifter. You are simply yourself." She gestured to the end of the alley, where the first hint of dawn was painting the sky. "The path is yours now. Not to run, but to walk." The woman melted back into the shadows, leaving Elara alone. She sat there as the sun rose over Veridia, illuminating the towers of the great city and the squalor of the warrens with the same impartial light. She was free, not from pursuit, but from the fear of herself. She had used her curse not to hide, but to heal. Not to become someone else, but to finally, fully, become who she was meant to be. She stood up, her legs weak but steady. She walked out of the alley, not as a monster or a miracle, but as a woman. The road ahead was hers to choose.